I don't know. Did you know Darius Lacasine? Darius Lacasine? EOD, Monday evening. He was at the jail there for a while. No, he had been out since the end of November. Went through a program out, and it was unexpected. I would have never expected him. I figured he would have stayed on it, but he just couldn't do it. It's just hard, as many of us know. Okay, we're in chapter 15 of Exodus. Um, God, we're almost halfway through Exodus. It's kind of like we put our foot to the gas and just moving right through. It usually takes us, yeah, I thought it would take us a lot longer than this. We usually, get bogged down in some other details, but really, Exodus is pretty straightforward. When by the time you get to the place where they're leaving Egypt, well, leading up to that, the lessons are pretty straightforward and simple. But then when God gets them in the desert, things begin to change. Their ability to provide for themselves is depleted in a month. And so they begin to get hungry, they begin to grumble. And we find in the text that God is done all this on purpose to test his people. And we discover that there's generally three tests that are meant to help them develop a sense of faith in God. And you remember where they were coming from, slavery. They had no life. It was totally at the mercy, really, of Egypt. And all that they could do is cry to God. But they really had no way of developing a, uh, a religion, a process by which to receive anything from God. There was no religious leadership. There was nothing. And so there was really no way to develop a relationship with God that would be one based in faith. And so that's what God was looking for. He was looking for and found it in Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Okay. And for a period of time, the children of Israel, more particularly with Joseph and that whole story that we went through well, we didn't go through it here in Genesis. We did it on Sunday night. And then we had this long gap, 430 years at least, where all sense of who God is as a matter of one you could trust was lost. And so God's rebuilding that. Now we've all been in places just like they've been, right? Where we found ourselves either under the thumb of something that enslaves us, or we have, for some reason or another, lost that a faithful dependence upon God where we can just give him everything and never have to worry. And so it's not easy to overcome those things. We often have to be tested in order to understand where God is leading us. And we spoke of this a couple of weeks ago, but I mentioned that if God intends to bless us, and a blessing is simply the ability to live under the will of God, whatever that may be. So God wants us to live under his will. He provides a way to do that. And the Israelites understood that to be blessing, that that's where everything in life would come from, under the will of God. And so in order for God to fill a vessel with blessing, he wants to make sure it can handle it, right? Otherwise, it's wasted. And we, as we see the development of the nation later, we see God's determining. He is going to determine not to waste a thing because it's precious. And so we'll get into that maybe later. Hey, Lee. So if you recall, we get to this place with the Song of Moses, and they've just seen miracle after miracle with the plagues and how God has rescued them. But then what's the big deal? The parting of the Red Sea. Okay. And so what does God do? He backs his people up to the sea where there's nowhere to go. And then the Egyptians pursue them from the west so they can't go back. So they're literally trapped in this place. And they begin to think that, well, they told Moses, what did you do? You brought us, there weren't enough graves in Egypt to hold us all. You brought us out here, you know? And so he says, just watch and see. He tells them, just watch and see. And so God blows this east wind and the sea parts, dries up the ground. This is all done at night. Okay. And they're told to walk through there. Now, let's just put yourself in their shoes. I don't know if I'd have been the first guy stepping out there, but they did. And so the first real test of faith in God was that they're going to walk through the sea. That's crazy. But they do it. Well, since you mentioned that, okay, so it's not really the Red Sea. We call it the part of the Red Sea. It's really the Sea of Reeds that is there, and a portion of that they went through actually is where they dug the Suez Canal. Okay, everybody knows the Suez Canal. You remember a few years ago they had a ship get stranded in the middle of the Suez Canal, and it just stopped world trade all over. And so the Suez Canal, when they were digging it, they actually did. They found artifacts when they were digging the canal. That, yeah,
Patterns of evidence, Exodus,
yeah,
system, God, studies.
yeah. Oh, yeah. There's a lot of evidence for that. Yeah. So we're going to look at this is the Song of Moses. Um, this was written. This is a masterful construction of a piece of poetry, and there's a lot of discussion. Hey, that's my wife Patsy, Dylan and Kathy and Dylan. Yeah. Um. Oh, I thought you were leaving. Don't leave. No. Hey, thank you, dude. I know they're wild.
You lucky you never had the raisins.
Well, I'll start feeding them on the van.
You got 19.
She's got them. Well, we're gonna do something. 19's too many. Anyway, so after this whole thing is over, the Song of Moses appears after those events at the Red Sea or the Sea of Reeds. And there's a lot of discussion about whether or not this was written much later, because it refers to some of Israel's later enemies. And then it was injected into this part of Scripture, or if Moses, in a prophetic way, is looking forward and seeing the enemies that the Israelites will have to face. Regardless, either way, we are given the result, um, and that is that all of these enemies are defeated. So just as God defeated the Egyptians in this fantastical way, He also deals with these other enemies. Now, when does He do that? Not now. We remember He steered them away from the Philistines because they weren't ready to fight on their own. Um, and so that long way around, and especially after they rebelled and spent 40 years in the desert, gave them that time. God didn't waste that time, although that generation would not enter the promised land. He developed in them a people that had to depend on Him and had to learn to fend for themselves with
It was
God.
all
Yeah, yeah. No, we still blow it. Uh, so it says, Then Moses and the people of Israel sang this song to the Lord, saying, I will sing to the Lord, for He has triumphed gloriously, or He has, it actually says, glorious, He is gloriously glorious. He is gloriously glorious, is the way that says. But the translation makes it triumph because it describes what they are talking about that really elevated His glory before the people. And this is what made His triumph glorious. the horse and his rider he is thrown into the sea. So you recall, after they had crossed through the Red Sea, the sea came back on. The Egyptians pursued them into the sea, and the water fell upon them. Yeah. So it says, "The Lord is my strength." All right, look at all these first person descriptors here. He's my strength, my song. He has become my salvation. This is my God. I will praise him. My Father's God. I will exalt him. So all of these are first person. This is almost like a confession that he's making about God. Okay. Now, Dylan, you're looking funny, like yours has got it's get worded differently. It's the same.
See exactly where he was.
I'm on 2 and 3 because a lot of times modern translations deal with the Old Testament in really majorly different ways, it seems. And so if your translation does that and we need to discuss it, I'm prepared actually. I've been studying this all afternoon. So so he says, so you got all these first person descriptors here talking about he's my strength, my song, my salvation, my God, my Father's God. All of these things that he's declaring is building this great foundation of faith that God is looking for and that Moses is declaring before him. And then verse 3, the Lord is a man of war. The Lord is his name, and that capital L, capital O-R-D, that's the name Yahweh in the Hebrew. So they're referring to him by his personal name. Now, a lot of people have trouble with calling God a man of war. But let's just think about it for a little bit. Can you think of times when God did go to war on behalf of his people? He did it here. Where else does he do it? He does in Numbers. Book of Numbers. There's a battle that he fights. In Second Kings, twice. He goes before the people, and one of them, they don't do anything. They just get up on a hill and watch. He tells them, go watch, and he takes care of this army. Yeah, that's right. That's right. The 7 armies of the 5 armies came against Israel, and before it was over, the 5 armies had slaughtered one another.
And there's so many instances like on Gomorrah.
Yeah.
Where he came down and just said, get out of here, I'm going to destroy the place.
So why do you think it's difficult to see God as a God of war in light of the New Testament? Because we see God's love so prevailing in Jesus. So we really have a hard time imagining that. But what did Jesus say? He said that a confession of faith in him, that you would actually do battle against evil. You would make war against evil. But yeah. Well, we don't want to get confused with temper and being the will. Yeah. Yeah. Well, what we find is that God is allowed to be an aggressor when it is for his people. Now we see that on the cross of Christ too, right? God is very aggressive in dealing with sin.
So you're talking about more than just the times when God did something. You're talking about when God actually became a warrior.
When we look at his character, we find that it is perfectly permissible for God to be a man of war because he intends to defeat what comes against his people. God doesn't need to defeat anything for himself. He's God. I mean, that's a given. But when it comes to his people, he is ready to be a man of war. And ultimately, we find that most distinctly on the cross because he pours out his wrath upon his son. The punishment for the defeat of sin and death occurs in the body of his son on the cross. That's pretty aggressive against what is sinful. But at the same time, what do we find in that act? We see God's justice at work, which requires action, which requires strength, which requires an aggressive nature often. But then we also see his love at work. when we look to Jesus and what he came to do for us. So the two are working together, and ultimately the two bring about eternal life together. But you can't bring about eternal life one without the other. So who God is in this, as his character is known to us, we come to appreciate it the closer we get to the cross, and then even beyond. Because let's face it, who hasn't prayed a prayer to God asking for his deliverance from something? We expect God to go before us and to fight, because he says he will. So just wanted to throw that out there and give you something to think about sometime later.
Did you
Maybe.
say that?
Did I say this thing? Yeah, that's right. That's what he said. That's when they were afraid that they were going to run out of graves in the desert. Yeah. Yep. Okay, so verse 4. And this is kind of it's a replay what happens. Pharaoh's chariots and his host, or his army, he cast into the sea. He is and his chosen officers were sunk into the sea. So what is he describing here in those two lines? He drowned them. The floods covered them. They went down into the depths like a stone. Okay, they sunk to the bottom. Done. And then we go into this passage of confession again. Your right hand, O Lord, glorious in power, your right hand, O Lord, shatters the enemy. So these two lines together, obviously, they're almost constructed the same, except the last line, God's glorious power is demonstrated in the way that he shatters his enemy. Okay? So when God shatters sin and death, okay, we're getting a replay of this. This is what God did for his people here. Their instrument of death was the Egyptian people, and God did away with it. In the greatness of your majesty, you overthrow your adversaries. You send out your fury. It consumes them like stubble. So he's describing here again just how God, he destroys his enemies, and it's definitive. It's complete. So when you set a fire to hay stubble, it doesn't take long and it's gone. You can't even start a fire with it. It burns so fast it won't even set anything else on fire. And that's what he's talking about here. So here at the blast of your nostrils, the water piled up. So here he is. He's connecting the parting of the Red Sea, not with a natural event, but this is a cosmic theological event almost, where God is just opening up the water with just a blow out of his nose. It's kind of crazy. With the blast of your nostrils, the waters piled up. The floods stood up in a heap. The deeps congealed in the heart of the sea. So what he's describing here, the water was just pushed up and froze, like you see in the movies. That's where they get this from. Yeah. The enemy said, and what happened? The enemy thinks, yeah, God's already revealed this to Moses, right? He said, this is what the Egyptians are going to think. Hey, we got them right where we want them. We'll go in there after. So the enemy said, I will pursue, I will overtake, all these first person things here. I will divide the spoil. My desires shall have its fill of them. I will draw the sword. My hand shall destroy them. So we got this long verse 9 that describes everything that the Egyptians were going to set out to do. And then verse 10 takes care of it just almost in an instant. You blew with your wind, the sea covered them. So he lets them go on and on about, this is what I'm going to do, the Egyptians. I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do that, and I'm going to do this. And kind of almost like in mid-sentence, God just blows and they're done with. And then it says again, they sank like lead. Before it was a stone, now they're sinking like lead in the mighty waters. Okay, verse 11. And then here's another confession that's stated, not in first person, but in third person. Who is like you, O Lord, among the gods? Question mark. Nobody. Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glorious deeds, doing wonders? Nobody. You stretched out your right hand, and the earth swallowed them. Now, they were swallowed by the sea, but when we see a reference like this about the earth swallowing, that was their idea of Sheol, the place of the dead. So that's what he's describing here. You took them straight to the place of the dead. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think the Hebrews invented rhetorical questions. Yeah. Um, verse 13, you have led in your steadfast love the people whom you have redeemed. Okay. So God's leading. He's leading in his steadfast love. Loyal love is another way that it's translated, especially in the English Standard Version. That's that Hebrew word hesed that we've used before to describe God's love for us. It's the word that the Greek translates into agape love in the New Testament, which describes Jesus' love for us and God's love for us and the kind of love we're to have for one another. So it's a very important idea. And we find in the Old Testament that its genesis is always with God, and he always shares it with us in order for us to either give it back to him or to give it to somebody else. Unveil it? No, I didn't, but that's another way of saying it. Yeah. So it's an important idea that shows up all the way through the Old Testament. It already has probably 30 times in Genesis and Exodus already, maybe more. And then it says, you have guided them by your strength to your holy abode or your holy house. So this has got a little prophetic twinge to it, because when Moses speaks of the promised land, he always speaks of it in that way. The land flowing with milk and honey, or the land that was promised to your forefathers, or something like that. This, when you talk about your holy abode or your holy house, it's almost always used to describe the temple. So we're jumped way from.
Are we still in the song though?
Yeah, we're still in the song. Yeah. So what Moses is really prophesying is that you have already in your mind prepared a place for them to meet you in your house. So it's like God's going to build a house. Solomon builds a house, and I'm going to throw the doors wide open so everybody can come in. Okay. You got to do it the right way, but you're always going to be welcome at my house. And so that's where this is going. So, as the peoples have heard and they tremble, pains have seized the inhabitants of Philistia. So what it is, this is not God's people. This is the nations, is what it's talking about. Pains have seized the inhabitants of Philistia. They're scared of you. Now are the chiefs of Edom dismayed. Edom was one of their number one enemies. Trembling seizes the leaders of Moab. They were always giving the Israelites problems. All the inhabitants of Canaan have melted away. And that was the people that they were going to displace to take the promised land. Terror and dread fall upon them because of the greatness of your arm. They are as still as a stone. Okay? So when God, every time he would perform a plague, what would he do? By my mighty arm. And so Moses is reminding his people in this song that every time that God raises his arm, it's victory for you. And that's a comforting thing when if you're out in the middle of nowhere with nothing, you want somebody that's going to be there for you. And so that's what he's really leading them there. He's leading them into this way of thinking. Let's see.
That's where they came up with the long arm of the law.
Well, probably so. Yeah. It says, until your people, O Lord, pass by, when you pass, meaning into the promised land, till the people pass by whom you have purchased. So he's used the word redeem here, and he's used the word purchase. Redeem was up in verse 13, and he uses it again in 16. So what did God do? Remember, how did he redeem and how did he purchase? They had to offer the firstborn of either the sheep or the goat to mark their doorpost. That was God's substitutionary way of redeeming the firstborn of Israel so that they could carry on. Okay, so when it talks about redeeming and purchasing, it always takes us back to that where God said, I allowed for a substitute for your firstborn. Where in Egypt, I didn't allow them for the Egyptians. They lost their firstborn. But I redeemed the firstborn as my own. So they fell under the protection of what God was doing. And of course, um, it was all intended and to fulfill the promise, okay, to Abraham that his people would carry on and be a blessing to the nations. And we see the fulfillment of that in Jesus. So it's not a small thing that, that it speaks of this. You will bring them in and plant them on your own mountain. Okay. Again, we're talking about the holy place, Mount Zion, or such like that. You will bring them in and plant them on your own mountain, the place, O Lord, which you have made for your abode. All right, so that's the temple again. Speaking of that, turn this thing off. It's about to die. The sanctuary, O Lord, which your hands have established. And then it says the Lord will reign forever. So much that he's spoken of in this psalm did not reign forever. The Egyptians, the Edomites, the Moabites, the Philistines, they were all defeated. And so what he's doing is he's drawing this kind of lengthy comparison that all of these are going to be wiped away. God is establishing a house for himself, which his people are going to be invited to and be a part of all the time, and it will be forever. It's never going away. And so that's just pretty comforting for folks that are wandering around in the desert, don't know where their next meal's coming from. Now, you think about all of this, we're fixing to see, they've they haven't been out of Egypt a month yet, okay? And they left with what? Bread in a bowl. And whatever the Egyptians put on their children's backs. Not a lot. All right. So then it carries on. There's this little narrative here that it separates Moses' song and Miriam's song. For when the horses of Pharaoh with his chariots and his horsemen went into the sea, the Lord brought back the waters of the sea upon them, but the people of Israel walked on dry ground in the midst of the sea. Then Miriam, the prophetess, the sister of Aaron, who was also the sister of Moses, but she's connected with Aaron because Aaron is been chosen for the priesthood, and so there's a connection there. She took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women went out after her with tambourines and dancing. And Miriam sang to them, "Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and the rider he is thrown into the sea." So I didn't mention this because it's hard to follow in the English, but Moses' hymn is broken down into about 8 or 9 different stanzas. And it's believed that this stanza that Miriam was singing, they would sing the one stanza, and then the women would sing this stanza. So like a calling back and forth, yeah, like a chorus to a song, yeah. And there is some evidence that it was used that way later on in their history. Any questions about any of that? It's probably
That'd be pretty old by then, though, right?
Moses?
Mary.
Oh yeah, they're all in their 70s and 80s. Yeah.
She see
Uh,
this point, baby.
right. And she was the one that. Yeah. So she's a. Well, if he was 80, she's in her 90s now. Dancing with a tambourine. How about it, babe? When you're 90 or older, dancing with a tambourine. Um, they live something because man,
Definitely didn't overeat.
none of that South Louisiana cooking. Okay, so they passed the first test. They trusted God. They walked through the sea, and this song is a great celebration of passing that test. Really, had they failed, it would be over. All right, there wouldn't be anything after this. But they passed the test, and so there's reason to celebrate. But then we get to this next part, and there's three tests that'll come up. There's the bitter water here. There's the test of the manna in the desert that we're going to look at, and then the test of the water and the rock. Yeah, yeah, yeah. He's supposed to speak to it. Yeah, yeah. That's well, we're gonna keep, we're gonna camp out on that a little bit because it seems rather harsh for God to take such extreme measures, especially with Moses when, well, more than symbolism, it's a condition of the heart. But you have to remember, um, not too long after that, God's ready to just wipe them all out and start over with Moses. And Moses says, "No, you're not. We're not starting this thing over." and and out of those two events together, because we need to read these things together. We learn a lot about the way God deals with our own sinfulness.
I'm really glad that Jesus came to petition.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
yep, no kidding. Okay, then Moses made Israel set out from the Sea of Reeds, and they went into the wilderness of Shur. So they're up in this. If you're looking at Egypt on a map, and the Mediterranean Sea is up there, they're kind of in the northeast. The northeast from Egypt is wilderness. That's where they are, and they're moving down into this wilderness of Shur, which is kind of southeast from where Egypt is. It's barren out there. Um, it's real cliffy. The Egyptians even called it the Valley of the Wall because it was real cliffy. It was hard for opposing armies to invade from that direction, so it's kind of a natural defense. And this is where God's leading His people to some of the worst area that there is. Okay, so he leads them down into this wilderness. They went 3 days into the wilderness and found no water. Now, 3 days without water is a long time. You ever been a day without water? Yeah, it's a long time. 3 days is a long time, but they found no water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink the water of Marah because it was bitter. Therefore, it was named Marah, which means what? Bitter. Okay. All right. So this is an interesting thing for two reasons. In this area of the world, they have these sinkholes that are 8, 12, 15 feet across, and you go about 4 feet down, and there's water that collects in them, and it's salty. And so, hence being bitter. Still that way today. In fact, there's a practice they do over there where you kind of dig out around where the water can pool, and they put a type of bush. It's like eucalyptus. Yeah, but that's not it because they don't grow there. But it's something like that. But it will actually absorb some of the saltiness out of the water, and you can actually drink it if you decide you want to drink it. So we get to the story, and all that kind of adds up as to being something special. The other thing about this, though, is that when you find in the Old Testament bodies of water like wells and springs and uh, rivers, they always represent life. So and when we looked at this in in our study in the histories, um, a lot of weddings, couples would meet each other at a well, and out of the meeting would come a marriage, and out of the marriage would come all these children, and so water came to represent life in a myriad of different ways. When Isaac was being pursued by those people that wanted him run out, man, every time Isaac would get somewhere away from everybody, he'd dig a well, and an oasis would spring up, and they'd run him off from that one, and he just kept going and kept digging wells, and God kept providing life. Well, here the water's bitter, okay, and so it's kind of like, what's God doing here? This doesn't match the other stories we've had uh, about water just being the source of life. This is not the source of life. But we're going to see what he's up to. I just had to kind of set the stage there. It says in verse 24, and the people grumbled against Moses, which are really grumbling against God, because Moses is God's man. It says, what shall we drink? And he cried to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a log. And he threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. So there's something interesting in here. This word where it says, and he showed him a log. That word showed is actually the root word for instruction or to teach or the law. Okay, so it's like he's saying, so he instructed him with a log, or he taught them with a log, or the law came about with the log. All right. So hang on to that, because then it says, there the Lord made for them a statute and a rule. What is that? He's instructing them. Okay. He's teaching it, and he's laying down the law. So the water's bitter. God says, use this instruction, the log, throw it in the water, and I'm going to make the water sweet. So the Lord made for them a statute and a rule, and there he tested them, saying, if you will diligently listen to the voice of the Lord your God, and do that which is right in his eyes, and give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you that I put on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord your healer. So God heals the water, okay, with this log, this instruction, and it gives life. And so the connection that is being made there is, you follow my instruction and you will have life. Okay. So the law is life. That's the first test. Let's see if you can do this. Let's see if you can follow my law. Okay. So the test is coming, right? And we find that they never pass. They never, well, and in some degrees they do, but it's because very, very difficult to do it all. But that's what he's doing here. He's using this log as, if, for lack of a better term, a metaphor for the law. And then you say, live by the law, and I'm going to continue to care for you, give you life, bring healing to you. Now, you would think that being free from slavery, there would be no need for healing. But really what he's talking about here is a spiritual healing that has got to occur, because they were 450 years away from God. If you stay away from God, we don't need 450 years. We need about 15 minutes. When we get away from him, even for that short a period of time, we discover very quickly that we need some healing, right? And so he's there for it. He's saying, you don't have to go look far. I've got a whole book of instruction that you can go to and begin to work these things out. You can go to me in prayer and work these things out. But you got to do it. He doesn't just pour it out, like I said before. He can, but he doesn't, because God's not going to pour it into a broken vessel and it just spill helter skelter and not mean anything at all. Make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So it's a great passage, and sometimes we read by these things and think, oh, some really cool miracle that God performed, but He's really teaching some very important things for life. Then they came to Elam. Elam was further south about 8 miles. So if they could have just held their complaints for another 8 miles, this is what they would have found: 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees. And they camped there by the water. So 12, isn't that a convenient number? One for each tribe. And 70, here's that number 70 again, which is a number of completeness, number of just what is needed. So we see it when Jesus sends out the 70. It's the number that was required to do what he needed to do. And these palm trees, 70 palm trees, represent that God had provided everything that they needed in this place. Yeah. So God, he almost always does this when we read through the Old Testament. He'll say to do something, and then he'll do it. Right after that, he'll give you an illustration about what this is going to mean for you. And the man, Paul, in his writing, he does this excellently too. He'll give you an instruction and then give an illustration or an example of that instruction. And that's what God's doing here. You want to know what healing looks like? Just an abundance. That's how God does things.
I know
And
that
he's
so many
helping.
times in perfect wisdom, he sets the stage perfect.
Yeah.
To where he comes to fruition, if you're involved, you learn.
Yeah. And then here comes the bull in the china
And
closet.
then you forget about it.
Yeah, here comes the bull in the china closet and tears it all up. Yeah. All right, chapter 16. So they set out from Elam, and all the congregation, meaning the entire nation of the people of Israel, came to the wilderness of Sin. Let's stop there for just a minute. Nobody's really sure the boundaries of what they're talking about here, but they were kind of midway down the Sinai Peninsula. Who says that? Peninsula at this point, and moving closer to Mount Sinai. Okay. But it doesn't have very good boundary lines. There's a lot of discussion about exactly where they were at this point. And there's a lot of discussion about whether or not every place that they stopped is recorded, because as I mentioned, they're almost a month out now and they've only talked about 3 places that they've been. So either they were moving like in groups, kind of hopscotching each other like we talked about before to get places, and they just didn't record everywhere that they were. So that's what makes it difficult to determine exactly where they were, because they were having 2 million people. If you think about that. Trying to think of the closest city with 2 million people in it.
Too bad they didn't have social media back then. They could have recorded every second of their life.
Yeah. Let's see. Austin, Texas now has 2 million people in it. I hear that Nashville, Tennessee has 2 million. That's a lot of people, man. Yeah. And Moses, he's having to take care of all of them. Okay, so between Elam and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month, this is a day, a year that they departed from the land of Egypt. And the whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbled. The word grumble is used like 9 times in Scripture. Like 7 of them are used for their time in the wilderness. Yeah, they grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. So Aaron's getting in on it now. And the people of Israel said to them, would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into the wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Now, there's an interesting thing. What they're complaining about, they're not complaining about not having any food. It's not enough. Wow. Okay. So what they would say is, man, we would rather suffer under the hand of the Lord in Egypt than be under his hand of blessing in the wilderness. That's basically what they're saying to God here. And of course, they're speaking it to Moses and Aaron. So they're complaining about the amount of food. We just don't have enough food. Wish we were still back slaves in Egypt, so at least we could have enough food. So, ooh, runs you all the way back to who? Esau selling his birthright to Jacob because he was hungry. So now we've got this thing where they're behaving like Esau. Oh, I would just go back to slavery if I had some of that red stew that you made there. See, so it doesn't take much to kind of turn yourself upside down with God here, and that's what they're doing um, because they believe that they're hungry. God's fixing to show them some things. So um, then the Lord said to Moses, "Behold, I'm about to rain bread from heaven." And I just love that line.
I find
Uh,
it interesting that God comes to them instead of Moses having to cry there.
oh, right here?
Yeah, because before, in every other instance, even when we get
Yeah,
to the water and the rock,
yeah. Moses has to go to
back
God.
to God and
Yeah,
say, but here it's like God's got an ear and he's here and
that's
attended to their,
that is an interesting point. Um, and he says it to Moses, but this is where we find that word test, and that may be why Moses doesn't call out because God approaches him first and saying, "Look, I'm about to rain down bread from heaven,
test them.
and I'm going to test them." So he's kind of pulled Moses to the side, so to speak, and saying, "This
I
is
don't
what
think
I'm
these
up to."
people really to eat. I think it's in the
Yeah,
thinking, not misery, it's like temptation.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
But if he's moving them to a place of faith, how often does emotion derail our trust in God? Yeah. So here we are. I mean, this is just like our life.
It is.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We get emotional and we get where we think we got to have what we need right now. The reason why, well, when people fast, why do they fast? Yeah. But when we fast, what we're saying is, yeah, or my body constantly tells me what to do. And here I am, I'm hungry, my stomach's, but I'm going to trust God. I'm waiting on God to speak. I'm waiting on God to do what he's going to do. And if I have to endure this, I'm not going to let my body overtake uh, my senses. I'm going to wait for God. And and so the same thing here. God's saying, I'm about to test you in this and see what you're going to do. And they fail. We'll look at it. But he's okay. It's a test. And so what is a test supposed to do?
Uh,
Find out what your weaknesses are so you can fix them. If you never know what they are, you can't fix a thing. Yeah. Yeah, you just swim in that water all the time and don't know it's dirty. So then the Lord said to Moses, "Behold, I'm about to rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them whether they will walk in my law or not." So he's going to lay down a law for doing this. We're going to see if they can do it. Seems to be a simple thing. On the sixth day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather daily. So Moses and Aaron said to all the people of Israel, "At evening you shall know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your grumbling against the Lord. For what are we that you grumble against us?" Well, what's Moses saying? You grumble against us all you want, it ain't gonna matter. I can't change a thing. So when you're grumbling against the Lord. And Moses said, when the Lord gives you in the evening meat to eat, and in the morning bread to the full, because the Lord has heard your grumbling, that you grumble against him, what are we? Your grumbling is not against us, but against the Lord. Moses is really making it clear here that if you're going to keep complaining, realize who you're complaining to. Okay. Yeah.
If you don't, yeah. I mean, I understand that they were for 450
Yeah.
years and then what's happening. I guess, I don't know.
Well, this was in the first month, and it took about yeah, and it took about 2 months for the plagues to unfold. So they've been witnessing this for 3 months, but they come to one point in their life where they're a little bit hungry, and they let their emotions get the best of them, and they've forgotten everything that God. They just want to be fed, and they want it now. I want it all, and I want it now. You know, and that's where they were, and Moses is kind of setting the table to say, look, what you're involved in here. This is not just a human event. This is a cosmic event. This is God who is bent down to be your people with you. We're going to see it in just a minute. He, yeah, the way he was leading it. Yeah,
But even with today, I mean, there's still like a lot of Jews who don't even believe Jesus was the Son of God. He was, he was.
well, not just used.
Yeah, I was.
A lot of people. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
But to this day, there's still Jews who go, he was a good man, he was private,
yeah,
he was not.
yeah. Then Moses said to Aaron, so we're back to Moses speaking to Aaron. This is the first time we've had this arrangement since the third or the fourth plague. Yeah. Yeah, we kind of moving Aaron back into that role, so when we get to the golden calf story, it all makes sense. Then Moses said to Aaron, say to the whole congregation of the people of Israel, come near before the Lord, for he has heard your grumbling. And as soon as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the people of Israel, they looked toward the wilderness, and behold, the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. Okay, so now they're seeing something different. Okay, before they could see the cloud, but now the glory of the Lord is enveloped in the cloud. And the Lord said to Moses, I have heard the grumbling of the people of Israel, and say to them, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread. Then you shall know that I'm the Lord your God. So he's going to provide. We know God by the way he provides. That's really what he's saying here. In your moment of need, you can know me by the way I will provide for you. Verse 13. In the evening, the quail came up. What? Come up from where? The quail came up. It doesn't say it came down. It just said it came up. So you get this on came and covered. Yeah. So they came. This was says came up. Came up and covered. So these covey of quail just show up. And they're covering everything. They covered the camp. And in the morning, dew lay around the camp. And when the dew had gone up, here's that word again. There was on the face of the wilderness a fine, flake-like thing, fine as frost on the ground. When the people of Israel saw it, they said to one another, what is it? For they didn't know what it was. And Moses said to them, it is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat. Okay, so manna means what? It means, what is it? That's what it literally means. Yeah, it means, what is it? Yeah. So they named it, what is it? Because they didn't have a name for it. So they just named it for what they asked him what it was. Um, this is what the Lord commanded. Gather of it, each one of you, as much as he can eat. You are to take an omer, which is a measure, about a quart, maybe, according to the number of persons that each of you has in his tent. And the people of Israel did so. They gathered some more and some less. Some people gathered more than an omer, some less. But when they measured with an omer, whoever gathered much had nothing left over, and whoever gathered little had no lack. What's God teaching them?
What's that? Okay. What you're told.
I'm going to provide you exactly what you need. You may go out there and not get enough. I'm going to make sure you have enough. You may go out there and you get too much. I'm not going to let you have too much. Okay? This is God's show. He's feeding his people. Okay? It's his bread, but also he's in control of the whole thing. And it's meant to teach them a lesson that you don't need to hoard. There's such an important lesson. God works out of abundance. He never works out of scarcity. You don't have to worry about God running out. But you do have to worry if you treat the things that God gives you as your own, because it's always his. And he's going to do with it what he will. And he's teaching them that right here. It really becomes important later as they grow up and to be a nation. But they forget this. They long forgot this. And the people of Israel did so. They gathered some less. I read past all that already. Each of them gathered as much as he could eat. Verse 19 is where I'm at. And Moses said to them, let no one leave any of it over to the morning. But they did not listen to Moses, who is who? God's man. When Moses speaks, it's like God speaking. He already made that clear when he met Moses at the burning bush. Some left part of it till the morning, and it bred worms and stank. And Moses was angry with them. Morning by morning they gathered it, each as much as he could eat. But when the sun grew hot, it melted. So you had to do it in the morning. You know, you had to do it right. And if they took too much, it bred worms and maggots. Okay? And became a reason for Moses to get angry. Well, it's kind of a sideline here, but we find out that it doesn't take much to get Moses angry. This is God's deal, okay? But yet Moses takes it, and this is what gets him in trouble later with the rock. See, we got to hang on to these things because the narrative is small as it starts out, which is the Hebrew writers are famous for doing. They'll take a small little incident, and then before you know it, it's become a major thing. And we've had this little foreshadowing to kind of prepare us, and this is one of those places. On the sixth day, which would be the day before the Sabbath, they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers each. And when all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, he said to them, this is what the Lord has commanded. All right? Tomorrow is a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Okay, what's the word Sabbath mean? Yeah, or to quit. So it literally means quit, but we take it to mean that this is rest. Now, a holy Sabbath is what? What's the difference? You're not resting just for the sake of resting. This is a way of setting yourself apart before God in this restfulness. So on the Sabbath became the day of worship, you know, those if you didn't have to walk too far. But for us, our Sunday is our Sabbath day because we hold it holy, or we should hold it holy before God. But it also, in all the peoples that existed at this time, nobody kept a Sabbath but the Hebrew people. And so it set them apart from everyone else in the world. One day a week, they all stopped, quit what they were doing, and it was meant to be a day to honor God because he rested on the seventh day. We're going to rest on the seventh day. So that's what it means. Bake what you will bake, and boil what you will boil, and all that is left over lay aside to be kept until the morning. So they laid it aside till the morning, as Moses commanded them, and it did not stink, and there were no worms in it. And then Moses said, "Eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the seventh day, which is a Sabbath, there will be none." So there's none. Rest. Quit. Depend on the Lord today. He's going to provide you with everything you need. Quit what you're doing. On the seventh day, some of the people went out together, but they found none. And the Lord said to Moses, "How long will you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws?" Okay, what has he said already? That if you keep these things, it's going to be life and healing. But if you keep breaking my law, you're going to, yeah, just so hard. Man, that's why Jesus is so important. I mean, really. So he gets upset. How long will you refuse? He says, "See, wait a minute, I don't want to skip. Yeah, on on 20, I'm at 28, 29. See, the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore, on the sixth day, he gives you bread for 2 days. Remain each of you in his place. Let no one go out of his place on the Sabbath day." So the people rested on the seventh day. Now it turns from Sabbath to seventh. Okay. Now why? Let's see. Does that happen? Uh, that's a good question. I've got to go back and discover why they did that. I didn't even notice that. It says Sabbath in verse 25, but in 26, but then after that he just calls it the seventh day.
Probably because he says the verse above that, this is why on the sixth day he gives you the bread for 2 days. So he specifically lays out, so on the seventh day, you don't do it, even though, and it's the Sabbath.
He is clarifying.
Yeah.
It's like he is clarifying for them.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah, that's exactly what it is. He's kind of having to talk down to him. Yeah,
Everybody knows that.
yeah.
Yeah.
And it's like this, the holy part of this is going to take you a while to figure out. You'll have to, yeah, you have to get the mechanics down, I guess, first before you can ever really realize what
What
I'm
the
trying to
Sabbath
do
is.
here. Yeah. Wow. I never even noticed that till right now. That's crazy. Now, the house of Israel called its name manna. It was like coriander seed, white, and the taste of it was like wafers made with honey. And Moses said, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Let an omer of it be kept throughout your generations, so that you may see the bread with which I fed you in the wilderness when I brought you out of the land of Egypt." And Moses said to Aaron, "Take a jar and put an omer of manna in it, and place it before the Lord to be kept throughout your generations." And the Lord commanded Moses, so Aaron placed it before the testimony to be kept. The people of Israel ate the manna 40 years till they came to a habitable land. They ate the manna till they came to the border of the land of Canaan. An omer is a tenth part of an ephah. I'm sorry. So he talks about place it before before the testimony to be kept. So this is looking forward a bit to where God gives instructions for the tabernacle and the construction of the ark to carry the 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 Ten Commandments, the stone tablets, which were the testimony to the law, and so a jar of this went into that container. We learn later that Aaron's staff that budded, which we'll see later, yeah, it went in the box and the stone tablets and the manna. And that's it for tonight. I'm gonna stop at 17. Yeah, yeah. So the first test in the wilderness, at the Sea of Reeds, they passed. The second test with the bitter waters, they grumbled. The third test, the manna from heaven, they grumbled. Okay, and here we're going to get to the water from the rock, and so they passed the first one, but they failed the final three, and then everything we really begin to see why this became so important. Okay, because the story moves beyond just what their spiritual needs are, and it's not focused on their spiritual needs. It becomes a very, I mean, it's focused on their physical needs, but later we see that where God's really trying to get to is where's your heart going to be in this? And it wasn't in the right place. Took them 40 years to clean up that mess. All righty, guys. Well, you're welcome. Bye bye for those that, that weren't here.